This is a game between Anatoly Karpov and Vladimir Kramnik. It was played in Monaco in 1995, so it was played in blindfold chess with rapid time controls. So it's quite amazing that grandmasters are able to play this kind of chess, and it's quite understandable if a mistake or two does occur in those games. And yet this game is a very good example of how to handle the Slav defense from the black side. So after the opening moves, we'll see that both sides develop their pieces, and in particular white has an extra pawn on the center, and black has on the other hand fairly convenient development of his pieces, and for the next few moves the play will develop around white trying to push e4 so that he can then develop the bishop from c1, which is currently stuck behind the pawn chain. So after black castles, white goes queen e2, and this already threatens to play pawn to e4, because then the bishop will be attacked. So black retreats. Now the idea is that if white does go e4 now, then black has capture, and then he can take here. So this is not good for white. So he wants to eliminate this bishop, which is controlling the e4 square. So he goes knight to e5. Black continues development. White exchanges the bishop. And now, again, he could try to play pawn to e4, but this would be a bit too early, because then if white goes e4, then black can go knight to b6, and this attacks both the bishop, which white would like to keep, and it also attacks the pawn. And so if white continues with e5, then the pawn falls and the bishop is still under attack. So this is not very good for white. So he wants to strengthen d4 yet again, so he goes rook to d1. Black increases the pressure against the knight on c3, and white played the main line, which is bishop to d2, just defending the knight. And here Kramnik played pawn to e5. This allows white to play d5, and now exchanging on d5 wouldn't be very good for black, because then white will control some important squares. So he just kind of ignores the step to the c pawn, and he plays rook to d8, and white exchanges. So now we have this pawn structure on the queen side, which is somewhat imbalanced. Black has a couple of weaknesses, but at the same time white has a hole on b4, and it's not easy for white to exploit the pawn on c6 being weak. But in the long run, of course, if black plays passively, then these pawns will become an issue, and black's play should probably happen somewhere on the b file, so at some point he might be able to play rook to b8 and then exert some pressure on the b2 pawn. And Kramnik gives a really good example of this type of play. So Karpov opens up the d file for his rook, and now Kramnik has to decide what to do with his pieces, and for example decide where's this knight going. And he plays pawn to e4. This opens up the square, well, possibly for this knight, but also maybe for the queen, and then the knight could maybe go to c5 and support the pawn to e4, and so on. So here white has to decide how to put pressure on the e-pawn. And in the game Karpov played bishop to b3, and then he transferred the bishop to c2, but this turned out to be a little bit slow, and also the bishop was a bit separated from the king side, where more of the action was happening later on. It was probably better to play something like queen to c2, and then the bishop would come to e2, and then would guard the g4 square. So after e4 and bishop b3, here we see a bit of an inaccuracy that Kramnik made. He allowed white to win the pawn. He could have just played something like rook to b8 and the position would be balanced. Instead he went queen to e5, And he missed a tactical trick, which Karpov also missed as well. So here white could have won the pawn by playing something like knight to e4, and then the bishop hangs, and if the bishop takes, the white takes on f6 with a check, and then he recaptures the bishop. Black would probably still get some counterplay here along the b file, but at least this is something that white should have done. In the game, he continued passively with bishop to c2, and it turned out that black is on time to generate some dangerous threats on the king side, and white's pieces aren't really well equipped to deal with that. Bishop d6, there's a threat of mate, and white has to play g3 to block the diagonal, but this weakens the light squares, and the bishop is still on the board. The light square bishop is still on the board, but it's just too far from the king side, and he's not able to bring the bishop back to the king side on time. Knight to c5, this strengthens the e pawn, and it also maybe threatens this pawn. Maybe he's looking at the d3 square, maybe threatening with something like knight to d3 at some point. Here, Karpov had another tactical opportunity to get at the e pawn, which again he probably overlooked. He could have played pawn to b4, forcing the knight to retreat, and after knight to e6, he could have actually captured there with knight e4. And it turns out that after pawn to f4, the queen doesn't have too many good squares for retreating, and well, he's going to be weakening his king a little bit, but at least white's winning the e pawn, and the position will be pretty complicated and about equal. Again, he missed this chance to get at the e pawn, and he goes pretty passively with king to g2, and now black starts to get at the light squares on the king side. So it's looking at all these squares. Rook d2. And it's important for black to play on both sides of the board. So now he goes bishop to e5, and this suddenly exploits the fact that the queen side is also kind of weak. All these pawns and pieces, they're not very stable here. And after rook d1, black is actually winning a pawn on the queen side. After bishop b1, he exchanges on c3 and wins the a pawn. And it turns out that after rook to a2, this knight is able to maneuver to c4. And at this point, he cannot take on b2 because of this check. The rook on d1 falls. And also later, the same idea is exploited. After rook d2, the knight comes to here, and if he takes here now, well, then the bishop on d1 is hanging as well. So he goes rook d1 to protect the bishop, and the knight regroups to the king side. And now it's going to be coming to f3, and this is going to be very, very good for black. He's up a pawn, and he has an attack. If white tries to get the pawn back with something like rook to a7, then black can strike back with rook to b2, and again it turns out that the kingside attack is too dangerous. So say if white takes, then black is able to get back the rook, and he's still going to carry on with the attack. Again, the light squares are very weak around the white king. So in the game, Karpov tried to cover up those light squares a little bit, but it didn't really help because the knight still comes to f3, and he's trying to put pressure on the e pawn, but it's a little bit too late. Now h3 is also under attack, so white's forced to weaken his king side even further. And now the knight is coming to f3 back, and then h2 is going to be the square for the invasion for the black queen. And basically, after the e4 pawn is well guarded, white has very few chances to defend, because his king is basically coming under very heavy attack, and there's no compensation for this attack whatsoever. Notice how the white bishops are very passive. So black very well managed to play in this game on the light squares, and created the attack against the white king without allowing the white bishops to come out and show their strength. And the game ended pretty soon. The king is completely exposed here, and black is winning the queen. So a very nice game by Kramnik, and he managed to outplay such a strong positional player as Karpov, and win in a very clean style, despite the fact that this was a blindfold chess game.